cards for all of these flops. And all of these cards are bad cards for your hand. Obviously now the flush is hit and the higher straight is hit. Here a lower straight is hit that you don't have. And of course the higher straight and the ace is hit here. Nothing very good has happened to your hand, but what you have to realize is it's a bad card for your hand, but it's a scare card for your opponent if your opponent was playing something like top pair in these situations. If your opponent has a king or a jack, an 8, maybe 8-9 here, and here certainly an ace-10, once your opponent has made a bet on the flop, you can start to define his hand. And what you need to do is you need to look for situations where, yes, maybe the card didn't help your hand, but the card probably didn't help your opponent's hand. Remember, it's very hard to make a big hand and hold them. And when these key, very defining hands, all of a sudden a straight is very possible here, a flush or a straight is very possible here, or against the ace-10, maybe he's thinking you have queen-jack, and at least you've made queens. And certainly here, a lot of different hands have hit, and people are always scared of an ace. An ace is a great scare card. So I'm not suggesting that you bluff at all of these, and you don't bluff every time a scare card hits. But you need to gauge your opponent. You need to see whether it looks like they have the resolve to try and run you down and catch you bluffing. And you need to look at cards like these and realize, yes, they were bad for your hand, but they might really be scaring your opponent. If you make a big bet, you can pick up some good pots on 4th Street. Okay, we're going to look at a couple of different 4th Street situations here, and what we're going to be examining is some of the factors that you may want to consider on whether to slow play a big hand or not. Here we have a rather typical 4th Street situation. Your hand is one of these two hands. You either have the nuts straight, the jack-high straight, or a smaller straight. And what I want you to consider on whether to slow play a hand or not is, what kind of cards can come up on 5th Street, and also what your opponent might have. In this situation, basically, there is no card that can come up that can really ruin your hand. Even if it comes a 9 or a 10, you're probably at worst tied. But there actually are some good cards that can come up that might get your opponent in trouble. And if we look at a couple of typical hands that your opponent might have here, like a jack-9 or a pair of 6s, you can see here that if he has a pair of 6s against your 9-10, if he hits a 4 or a 9, he's going to have a smaller straight than you, and he might lose a really big pot to you on 5th Street. So if he has a hand like jack-9, he might hit a jack for 3 jacks, but he also could hit a 6, which again is going to get him in very big trouble. He has a 9-high straight, which would lose to your jack-high straight. And the worst thing that can happen to you against this hand is that it comes a 10. But again, you're only going to split the pot with him. You aren't going to lose the pot. So you're only risking a split of the pot, but there are actually some cards that can really get him in trouble. So it really pays sometimes to slow play a big hand like this. On the other hand, if you look at this 6-4 here, there are a lot of cards that can give you trouble. Any 9 or 10, for example, and now one card beats your hand, or a 6 ties your hand. So now you're risking getting tied by a hand like the 6s, and certainly if it comes a card like the 10, now the 9 makes a higher straight. I'm not saying that it isn't right sometimes to slow play a hand like this, but you need to be very careful when slow playing a smaller straight, whereas with the big straight, usually it sort of pays to wait and maybe let your opponent get himself in trouble. Okay, now let's look at another hand here. You might think that it might always be right to consider slow playing a full house, but actually I think there are some times when it's very wrong to slow play a full house, and some full houses are more vulnerable than others. So we look at a nice typical full house flop on 4th Street. Of course, the board is paired. It's the only way to make a full house. And you have one of these two hands. You either have the top full with queens full, or you have the bottom full with deuces full. And obviously queens full is a much safer hand, and I would suggest that very often you might want to consider slow playing a hand like queens full. There really is almost no card that can come up that can really scare you. Maybe if another 7 hit and your opponent had a 7, you could lose, but if he has 3 7s, he's going to get into big trouble against you, and he only has 1 out in the deck. Another reason to slow play the queens full, though, is because if you think about it, there isn't a whole lot left for your opponent to have. Yes, he could have a 7, but if he doesn't have a 7, you have 3 of the queens. He very well might have a flush draw here. So slow playing this hand and allowing his flush draw to get there is obviously very good. If it comes a heart and your opponent's playing the flush, he's going to lose a big pot to you on the river. Also, slow playing and allowing a king or an ace to hit, and maybe allowing your opponent to hit, a big two pair, that is also going to lose to you, and you're really not scared of any card coming up. On the other hand, if you have a hand like deuces full, there are a lot of cards that can come up that are really going to give you trouble. Certainly if it comes another 7, now you lose to any bigger pair, even a pair of 3s in the pocket. Or if it comes another queen, now all your opponent needs to have is a queen or a 7 to beat your hand. So your hand actually is somewhat vulnerable. But there's another reason to not slow play a hand like deuces full, and that is now all the queens are still left in the deck. So it's actually quite possible for your opponent to have a hand like ace-queen because you don't have all the queens in your hand. So by not slow playing, you're allowing your opponent to maybe lose some money to you on Fifth Street because it's more likely that he has a calling hand. If you look at the situation where you have the queens full, it's just harder for him to have a hand that can call on Fifth Street, so you kind of want to let him catch up to get into trouble. Whereas with the deuces full, since if he catches up, he very well might beat you, and he is much more likely to have the kind of hand that can call you. It's very important to not slow play a hand like this. And these are some of the things you need to think about when considering slow playing on 4th Street.
Okay, we're going to look at another strength tell here. We have Lori here in first position, and she checks, and she's playing heads up against Jared. And let's watch him put the chips in the pot here. You see his hands are just shaking. Again, this is almost counterintuitive. I think a lot of people would infer that if someone were putting the money in the pot and his hands were shaking, that he might be bluffing, that he's probably very nervous. But actually, this is usually a sign of extreme strength. There's just a lot of adrenaline pumping through his veins. He's very excited. It's actually a sign of excitement, and you get excited when you have a very big hand. It's very hard to control the adrenaline there, and he is betting. We've looked at this at a couple of angles. You really need to be careful, particularly when an inexperienced player puts money in the pot and their hand is shaking. This is also the kind of tell that's very hard to control. So it would be a very hard tell to send out a false tell on, and it's a very hard tell to disguise if you have the problem of getting very excited when you flop a big hand. So this is definitely one of the reasons why, as a player, you need to become very comfortable in these types of situations. Because if your hands are shaking when you flop a big hand, that's going to be a sure sign of strength. Any of the experienced players at the table are going to know that, and they're going to avoid your big hands. Again, it's very important to be comfortable, and then they're not going to pick up one of the classic strength tells that there are in No Limit Hold'em.
Okay, I'd like to discuss some general Fifth Street or river betting concepts. And one thing you're going to need to do if you're going to be a feared, aggressive, and unpredictable player at No Limit Hold'em is you need to learn to value bet on the river. There are going to be a lot of marginal situations, but situations where you still probably have the best hand. It's going to be very important that when you suspect that you have the best hand, that you are willing to bet and try and cash that bet on the river. And that's going to do a lot of things for your game. First of all, if you value bet, that means that you can bluff more. And the reason that is because if opponents see that you're willing to bet a marginal hand, but a good hand, then it's going to be more scary for them to try and catch you bluffing, because when they're thinking about the kinds of hands that you have, they're going to realize that a certain percentage of the time, you're not going to have a great hand, but you're still going to have them beat. So it's going to be harder for them to call you, and your bluffs will certainly become more effective. And it just keeps them on their heels, because they really don't know whether you have a huge hand, they don't know whether you have a mediocre hand, and they don't know if you're bluffing. On the flip side of that, if you don't value bet, and this is something you need to pay attention to when you're playing and you're studying your opponents, and over the course of a night or over the course of days or weeks, if you're playing with the same group of friends, you need to look and you need to identify the players that aren't willing to value bet a marginal hand. And those are the players that you actually, even though they may appear to be tight players because they turn over that pretty good like top pair with a pretty good kicker, but they aren't willing to bet it on the river, they may appear to you to be very tight, but actually they are just the kind of player that you may want to look up on the river when they make a bet, because they're probably not betting a good hand, though a marginal hand, so they'll probably either have a huge hand, a hand like a set or a straight or a flush or whatever might be a very good hand on the river, or they're probably bluffing. So it actually becomes easier to call